Hello, my name is Dr. Peter Whitewood and I'm a Senior Lecturer in History at York St John University. And I'm going to talk to you today about the Russian Revolution of 1917, or more accurately, the Russian Revolutions of 1917, because there were two in that year. There was one in February and there was one in October. And the Russian Revolution was one of the most significant events in world history. Without the revolution, there wouldn't have been the Soviet Union, which of course rivaled the United States in the Cold War. Without the revolution, there wouldn't have been the Stalin era and all the brutality and violence that came with it. So this was an event which changed world history. And so what I'm going to do today is go through some of the key parts of 1917 and look at the key forces that motivated people to rise up against the imperial Russian autocracy and overthrow that royal regime and establish a new type of state and government. But I'll also talk about the reasons why Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party managed to take advantage of this and seize power themselves in October and establish a revolutionary state. At the very end, I'm going to talk a bit about the different interpretations of the Russian Revolution, because it's been a very divisive subject down the years. It's one that's, the Russian Revolution is quite a political subject, so it's attracted very polarized interpretations and perspectives on how we should understand these events, from those historians who saw these events as nothing but a coup d'etat carried out by Vladimir Lenin, and on the other hand, historians who've argued that this was more an authentic popular revolution. So turning to the events of the revolution themselves, we're going to start in February, so the first of these revolutions of that year. And the February Revolution, the key spark to it was food shortages. And this was because there was a war going on. It was the First World War. Russia had had a bad war up to this point, and this was causing lots of strain on Russian society. The problem wasn't necessarily that Russia was running out of food, because it's a very large agricultural country. The problem was logistics. So Russia, the Russian state, couldn't move the people it needed to the Eastern Front, so the soldiers, but also provide food to the cities at the same time with its creaking infrastructure. So soon enough, this creates discontent in some of the major urban areas, places like Petrograd, the capital. And by February, there are strikes starting to break out. In Petrograd, there is demonstrations, there's anger at the food shortages. And this comes to a head on the 23rd of February, which you can see here on the slide, was a demonstration for marking International Women's Day. But this was a point where people were gathering together, and so it soon started to become a much bigger affair and started to attract different types of protesters who began to call for the Tsar Nicholas II, who is pictured here, to step down. Things, however, get much worse when Russian troops then fire on the protesters in an effort to disperse them. And of course, this just makes events get out of control. So even more protesters join the crowds. And at this point, people are more openly calling for the removal of the Tsar, and they also wanted Russia taken out of the First World War, which was seen as the source of their ongoing problems. Tens of thousands of troops now also start to mutiny and join the protesters, notably the Volinsky Regiment, which was an elite regiment in Petrograd, and this was a sign that things were going very badly for Nicholas II and for his hold on power. Because the Tsar, he's losing the control over the military, he's losing the ability to crush the protesters. So on the 27th of February, the Tsar's cabinet resigns. And they encourage him, the liberal politicians, they encourage the Tsar that he has to abdicate. This is the only way out. And that he should appoint his son as his successor. Nicholas II realizes that he's got no other option but to abdicate at this point. And he doesn't want his son to become Tsar, though he chooses his brother, the Grand Duke Mikhail. Mikhail, however, rejects the crown, because he knows, he's quite aware that the crowds, the masses of people protesting in Petrograd would not accept him as Tsar. They don't want a continuation of the Romanov dynasty. And that's pretty much it for the autocracy in Russia. Once Mikhail rejects the crown, it brings the hold which the Romanovs had had on Imperial Russia for centuries to an end. And that is how the imperial royal autocracy ended in Russia. And with the Tsarist system gone, the two forces which had driven the revolution, so that's the working classes on the one hand, but also the liberal political opposition, they defined the new political environment. So on the one hand, the liberal middle classes, so the politicians who had been in the old Russian parliament, the Duma, they set up a new government called the Provisional Government. Now, the key thing about the Provisional Government is it was provisional. It was only meant to be temporary. And I'll come back to this in a second. It was led by this character here on the slide, Georgy Lvov, who was a liberal, kind of noble prince. But the Provisional Government was actually quite progressive. So it does lots of things which the protesters actually wanted. So freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. But, as I say, the key point about the Provisional Government is in its name. It was provisional. What these liberal politicians wanted was to eventually elect a constituent assembly. So this would be a properly elected body, not just self-appointed like the Provisional Government. And the constituent assembly would sort out the really big problems in the Russian Empire. So things like the land question. So the peasants wanted land. They felt they were being exploited, but it's a very difficult thing to arrange and organise. And the Provisional Government didn't feel they had the authority as a self-appointed government to sort this out, and so it was to be left to the Constituent Assembly. The problem was that this maybe just put off sorting out some of these bigger burning issues which were motivating people to protest in the first place. The other force in Russian society at this time was the so-called Petrograd Soviet. This was the revolutionary body. So the Petrograd Soviet represented the workers, the peasants, and soldiers. And its history went back to 1905, when it was first formed during the 1905 revolution, which was very much a precursor to the events of 1917, another bout of dissatisfaction and protest against Nicholas II. And Soviet in Russian means council. And so soon enough, various smaller Soviets started to emerge at different levels in different cities at the grassroots. So the Soviets were the real kind of engines of the revolution further down the chain. Hundreds of Soviets had appeared across Russia by spring 1917. They were the centres of leftist activism and radicalism in the country. So what this meant is, in the big picture, there are two political forces in Russia after the February Revolution, the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet. And this was a relationship that's been called dual power. And so the liberal politicians in the Provisional Government, they were geared towards the middle classes, the business classes, and so on, whereas the Petrograd Soviet was much more focused on the workers, the soldiers, and the peasants. And the Petrograd Soviet became very popular across Russia for obvious reasons. It seemed to be more of a revolutionary, authentic body. It also controlled local army units, and it had control over various key pieces of infrastructure too, such as the railway system and the telegraphs. The Provisional Government really was trying to hold Russia together until they could elect the Constituent Assembly. That's how it saw its that's how it saw and perceived its role. So that means that the pace of change was slow. But in many respects, the Petrograd Soviet was also quite happy with a slow pace of change. And this is one thing which we shouldn't underestimate. The Petrograd Soviet certainly contained some more radical socialist individuals and parties, but it was quite orthodox in a Marxist sense. Because in Marxism, and the way that many Russian socialists and revolutionaries conceived of the revolution, you had to go through various different stages, and this is something which Karl Marx talked about. So to get to communism, you had to first get to socialism, but before socialism, you needed to have capitalism, and so there was an order and a process. And you only moved from one stage to the next when society had kind of ripened and was ready to move from one point to another. The Petrograd Soviet, by and large, did not think that Russia was ready for a socialist revolution yet. They assessed 1917 and the February Revolution as being a bourgeois revolution, so they were very much still at the capitalist stage. And they had to let the revolution mature at its own pace, and then they would move to a socialist revolution, a socialist next point of development. As we will see, others did not agree. So Vladimir Lenin and the minority Bolshevik Party were much more radical, and they did not think or agree with the slow kind of pace which the Petrograd Soviet endorsed. They wanted socialist revolution immediately. They believed that the time was ripe, but it's worth stressing that Lenin was in the minority here. The Petrograd Soviet was happy to let the revolution mature on its own terms, and when it reached socialism, it reached socialism. The provisional government, of course, were middle class. They weren't looking to create socialist revolution. And so part of understanding 1917 is to try and work out and understand how the Bolsheviks end up seizing power in October, when at the beginning of this year they were in a minority position with opinions which were also in the minority. So turning to some of the kind of big problems in Russia at this point, which were not being solved by the new government. So remember, the provisional government was happy to put things off to the Constituent Assembly. The Petrograd Soviet was not pushing for radical change like Lenin wanted. And so there were three problems which became they were never resolved, and they became fuel for the more radical movements in Russian society at this point in time, and their lack of resolution helped drive support to the Bolsheviks. And the first is the food supply problem, or as I put here, the problem of bread. Because Russia was a big grain exporter before the First World War. It's an agricultural country. But as I've said already, the demands of the war put extreme strains on the food supply system in the Russian Empire. The Russian army was enormous. It needed feeding. It took grain from ordinary people. There was also a problem of being on a war footing during the war years, in that fewer consumer goods are produced as well. And so if you're a peasant who wants to sell grain, there's not that much you can buy with the money you get for it. So this makes them even less inclined to take grain to the market. So they might feed grain to the animals instead. They might brew it into alcohol. And so the food supply system is breaking down still in 1917. The problem predates the formation of the provisional government, but they had to deal with it. But the problem was they don't have radical solutions, perhaps radical solutions that were actually needed. All they do is appeal to morality and duty. So they write appeals to the peasants, encouraging them to give up their grain for the war effort. And unsurprisingly, this doesn't work very well. They threaten to use force, but they never follow through with this. They also try and establish some state control over the grain supply to get it moving again, but this doesn't work either. So ultimately the provisional government fails to solve the food supply issue, and of course the Bolsheviks, with Lenin, they say they've got the solutions to these problems, as they did all the other problems. The second burning issue of the day was land. This was a huge issue that I've already alluded to in Russia. Because land, Russia was a predominantly peasant country, and the peasants felt that they were entitled to more land. And this was part of the reason that they'd supported the revolution in the first place. Now, the Bolshevik Party and Lenin, they wanted land given to the people without compensation to the landlords. So the landlords would just simply lose it, and it'd be divided up among the ordinary peasants and workers. This was an attractive prospect for the peasants, as you can imagine, because they'd already started seizing land from landlords in 1917, so independently they're already doing this. But the provisional government don't support this approach. They want a more ordered and moderate solution to the land question. And one thing they try and do is to establish local land committees, for instance, to try and bring some order to this free-for-all. But ultimately, a final decision about the land question would not be made by them. They saw the Constituent Assembly as being the body that would actually take that final decision. They because they saw themselves as a temporary government, they didn't feel they had the authority to provide a definitive solution to the land question. And this was a big mistake, because we can maybe speculate that had the provisional government been bolder, had actually they provided a more fixed and definitive solution to the land question, it wouldn't have given the Bolsheviks the kind of the way that they needed to achieve popular support, because it would have taken a lot of heat out of this debate, and it would have deprived the Bolsheviks of a key part of their message, which was they're going to solve not just the food question, but the land question too. And the final issue, key issue in 1917 was the problem of peace. So what to do about the war. So the provisional government came into power during a bloody conflict, the First World War. Millions died, of course, in the First World War. There'd be extensive loss of life in Russia, and many hundreds of thousands of people captured already. Should they withdraw immediately in 1917? That was the question. Was this even possible? Could the provisional government break its treaties with the Allies and the things which Nicholas II had signed up to before 1917? It's also important to note that right at the very beginning of the revolution, in early 1917, the Russian population were not necessarily totally against the war. So many still supported it because they didn't want to lose territory to Germany. But as the months wear on, the war becomes less of a popular cause. So public opinion does begin to shift. And this puts the provisional government in a difficult position, because the Bolsheviks, of course, are making the most of this in their propaganda messages. So they talk about the land question, they talk about the food question, and they talk about the war. And of course, they say that they will withdraw from the conflict. Now, the provisional government did not actually want to withdraw from the war. They mistakenly believed that actually continued participation might bring society together. It might, this revolutionary fractured society, maybe it would bring something for them to coalesce around. And there were very few positive outcomes as they saw it from withdrawing from the conflict. And this came into public view at several points during the year, but most notably in April 1917, when Pavel Milyukov, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he made it clear in a secret note to the Allies in April that Russia would continue to stand by its obligations in the war, and that it was still signed up to the idea of achieving a decisive victory, which would mean harsh penalties in peace settlements and territorial annexations, potentially. This type of message, when it was leaked and was in the Soviet press, just caused more protests in Russian cities and in Petrograd, because as much as many still supported the war, they didn't necessarily support the war in the way that the Tsar had been prosecuting it. So that's trying to achieve decisive victory over Germany and reparations payments and a punishing peace, as there eventually was, of course, with the Treaty of Versailles. But on the other hand, we I suppose should also appreciate the problems of bread, peace and land were very difficult to solve. These were intractable problems for the provisional government, which has only just come into power. So I think as much as we can criticise them for not being bold enough, not taking more decisive action, is it realistic? You know, how much really could they have done in the short time in which they were in government? And of course the Bolsheviks had it very easy at this point in time, because they were promising all the solutions. They would solve the food supply, they would solve the land question, and they would get Russia out of the war. Now, as we know, from looking at the history of the Soviet Union, they don't really do any of these things. They don't fix the land question, they don't really solve the food supply problem, and while they do get Russia out of the war, it comes at an enormous cost. to Russia in terms of lost territory. So it's always easy to be on the sidelines, as Lenin and the Bolsheviks were, but in government they had a very different experience. So to talk a bit more about Lenin, because I've mentioned him a few times already in the Bolsheviks, who was he? What kind of ideas did he push forward? I've said that he was in the minority in terms of his political views. In the first few months of 1917, he was radical. He was on the radical kind of fringes of the revolutionary movement. He didn't agree with the Petrograd Soviet that they should take the revolution slowly and let it mature on its own terms. He wanted to push the socialist revolution immediately. So Lenin wanted to immediately change the Russian Revolution in 1917 into another socialist revolution, and this for him would be on the way to establishing communism. Lenin had also not really been in Russia much over the past years, and certainly past 2 decades really. He'd been often forced to live outside the Russian Empire because of fear of being arrested. But he returns in April 1917, and with German assistance he comes back to the Russian Empire, and he travels famously in a sealed train with German assistance, and he comes from Switzerland. And of course the German government were very happy for Lenin to be sent back to Russia, because he was a destabilizing force. Undoubtedly he was someone who was going to cause trouble for the provisional government and Russia's war effort. And once Lenin arrives in April, he outlines his revolutionary theory on the future course of the revolution, and this was called the April Thesis. And so in the April Thesis, Lenin calls, as I say, for an immediate proletarian socialist revolution. And so that would be that the Soviets, so bodies like the Petrograd Soviet and the various different Soviets across Russia, they would become essentially the government. They would take power away from the provisional government. He wanted private lands immediately expropriated and given to the peasants, and all of this was summed up in a slogan, "All power to the Soviets." However, despite Lenin's pleas and calls for immediate revolution, right until late summer 1917, he and his party were in the minority. The Bolsheviks were outnumbered in all important socialist organizations and bodies by other more moderate parties, so the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries, to name the 2 key other parties. In June 1917, for instance, at the first All-Russian Congress of Soviets, as it says here, Lenin was unable to convince others of his belief to cease cooperation with the provisional government. So he couldn't change the minds of the more moderate socialists that they had to immediately have another revolution and create socialist society. His views were in the minority. And it was also in this background that the Bolsheviks started to recruit their own paramilitary force, which were called the Red Guards. These were volunteers committed to the defense of the ideals of 1917, and who would later play a key role in the October seizure of power itself in a few months' time. So there are a couple of events which I've not talked about, which I'll go through now, which change this dynamic. So Lenin is unpopular. The Bolsheviks don't have vast amounts of support, but things change over the summer, and there are 2 kind of key events which really start to move popular support and eventually mass popular support towards the Bolsheviks. So tensions in Russia reach another high point in July 1917, and this was again really driven by the unresolved problems in society which I've talked about already, and there is another kind of crisis known as the July Days between the 3rd and 4th July, and there were more mass demonstrations erupt in early July. Now, these were not coordinated by the Bolsheviks as sometimes suggested. They were authentic demonstrations led by the people, but the Bolsheviks try and get involved and organize them and try and use them to further their own revolutionary ambitions. As a result, the Russian government denounces the Bolsheviks, denounces Lenin as a German agent, which was a popular conspiracy theory about Lenin and his role. Orders were given for the arrest of Bolshevik leaders, the closure of their newspapers, and so leading Bolsheviks, people like Trotsky, were arrested, and Lenin is forced to flee Russia, and he goes into hiding in Finland. In order to diffuse these tensions, at the end of July, a new coalition government is formed. So there's another iteration of the Russian government, and this is headed by someone called Alexander Kerensky. And Kerensky was a socialist, so he was a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. He's kind of a moderate figure in between kind of sitting between the more radical socialists and the liberal middle classes. Now Kerensky tried to consolidate his position and the position of the government, and he holds a conference in Moscow, but this is met by even more strikes and a boycott by the Bolsheviks. And it's at this point, because Kerensky is sensing that he is losing control, that he has a discussion with the General Lavir Kornilov. And Kornilov is pictured here. He is the new commander of the Russian army. And they discuss how order can be restored and how the military can do this. At the end of August, however, Kerensky has second thoughts. So he goes back on his discussions with Kornilov, and he starts to worry that actually there might be a military coup. He's given too much leeway to Kornilov, and his troops are already advancing on Petrograd. And so this is a bit of a murky affair, the so-called Kornilov coup, the Kornilov affair, because Kerensky certainly encouraged the Russian army and Kornilov to restore order, but it seems that there was some miscommunication, misunderstanding, or maybe Kornilov himself started to get outsized ambitions about seizing power and establishing a military dictatorship. In any case, Kerensky has second thoughts in August, and he has to call upon the socialist parties, people like the Bolsheviks, the socialist revolutionaries, to help defend the city, Petrograd, from the advancing Russian army, from Kornilov's troops. And this attempted coup damages Kerensky's image in a major way. It undermines his position, undermines the government, and it's a big event in 1917 that drives a lot of support towards the Bolsheviks. Because what the Kornilov affair really underlined for ordinary people was that the revolution was under threat from the right wing military. Maybe there would be a counter-revolution, maybe there would be a military dictatorship. And it seemed to many that the Bolsheviks were the people who actually might be able to protect the revolution. And so it pushes people towards the radical positions, and Lenin reaps the benefits. And this is where we get to the seizure of power itself in the 25th of October 1917. So when Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks finally do seize power, really benefiting from the popular support that they'd gained since the kind of shambles of the Kornilov affair in August. Now, it still takes quite a while for Lenin to convince the Bolshevik Party that the time is right to seize power, and Lenin has to have quite a long and protracted debate with the Bolsheviks, many of whom really were still inclined to side with the views of the Petrograd Soviet, that they should let the revolution mature on its own terms. But Lenin really, maybe by the force of his own personality, convinces the Bolsheviks that the time is right to seize power and construct a socialist state. The two Bolsheviks who really hold out are Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, who are pictured here at the top of the slide. So they are still against this. They are unsure of this plan to seize power. Their views really don't matter in the end because everyone else goes for it. And it's worth noting that both Zinoviev and Kamenev are executed in 1936 in the Stalin period, and this history of their resistance in 1917 is an issue which comes up. But with the party on board with Lenin's plan, the Bolsheviks establish a so-called military revolutionary committee, which is headed by Trotsky, and this is to stop any government resistance or counteraction to the attempted coup. And the way this kind of sparked was that it was a time of great tension in Petrograd, and Kerensky and the government were expecting some kind of move against the Bolsheviks, but then at the same time the Bolsheviks wanted a pretext to launch their seizure of power. And on the 23rd of October, kind of sensing that something is in the air, Kerensky ordered that the Bolshevik newspapers and printing presses be shut down. Lenin then uses that as a pretext to launch the seizure of power, and so that's given him the opportunity that he needed. And at the bottom of this slide here is not the actual kind of photo from the events themselves, but from the future reenactments of the storming of the Winter Palace, which would take place periodically in the Soviet Union, as these events were commemorated. And this was not a kind of a very bloody or chaotic uprising. There was certainly some casualties, but by this point in time, it was quite a smooth transfer of power. The Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace, they arrested the government, and that was pretty much it. They took power. And I think that it was that way because the Bolsheviks are really at the height of their popular support by this time. Certainly they start to lose support in the following months, and when the Constituent Assembly was finally convened in January 1918, they lose a majority. They don't actually win the majority they were expecting, and acting like the authoritarians they were, they simply close the Constituent Assembly and establish a one-party dictatorship. And so we need to see, I think, that the popular support which had driven and motivated them to seize power in October didn't last. And of course, from 1918 onwards, there is a bloody civil war, which goes out of the realms of what I'm talking about today. So with power in hand, Lenin appeared in late October at the second session of the Congress of Soviets, and he declared, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." And as many of you probably know, the Soviet Union was established after the Russian Civil War in the early 1920s, and they established a socialism of a kind, but this was more a Soviet socialism, which then became the brutalities of the Stalin era. Okay, so I just want to end with a few conclusions and raise a few questions, underline a couple of things which I've talked about today. So, firstly, why was Lenin successful in 1917? You know, I've said he was in the minority in the start of 1917, but then the Bolsheviks win majorities in the major socialist party bodies by September, October, encouraging him to seize power. Is Lenin the explanation for this? Was it due to the force of his personality, that he was adept at propaganda messaging, he was able to convince others in the Bolshevik party to seize power? Or should we put more emphasis on the provisional government? Should we look at its mistakes? It didn't solve the big problems of the day. It put off sorting out the land question, for instance, until the Constituent Assembly was convened. It's a combination of these two things, but Lenin, without doubt, was essential to the Russian Revolution, and you cannot imagine it happening without him. So there is, you know, as this second point says here, which is more important, Lenin or the wider context? Both really, but we might place emphasis more on one than the other. And there's, I think the last three questions here relate to how we understand the Russian Revolution. It has been a very political subject going back decades, certainly when historians wrote about the revolution in the Cold War years, because at that time the Soviet Union was deemed to be the enemy of Western civilization, and so this did shape and influence how history was written. And in early histories of 1917, the events were really kind of framed as a political history. So early histories of the Russian Revolution, kind of the orthodox perspective, as it's sometimes called, really examined these events through politics, and so looked at Lenin's actions, looked at the Bolshevik Party as a conspiratorial organization committed to establishing a one-party dictatorship, that the Bolsheviks didn't really care about the people and what they wanted and their desires, and they were only out to take advantage of the chaos of 1917 and establish a dictatorship. And that had been a quite dominant explanation for several decades until a separate kind of challenge to this came along, known as the revisionist view. And the revisionists, instead of looking at things and the events of 1917 through the lens of political history, examined it through social history. So for the revisionists, of course, you can't ignore Lenin, but you can't ignore the people. The February Revolution was a popular uprising. Lenin was abroad when it happened. Many Bolsheviks weren't involved. And so the revisionists underlined that to understand the revolution, you needed to take the people seriously. You needed to understand their ambitions, their desires, their motivations. What motivated ordinary factory workers to join a Soviet, to form a strike committee? You can't understand the revolution without seeing this social side. But why that was controversial, certainly during the Cold War, is because it seemed to legitimize the origins of the Soviet Union, which of course was an authoritarian state. And looking back through hindsight, we all knew about the history of the Stalin era, and the brutality of that period. And so for some in the Cold War, it was unacceptable to give 1917 and the origins of the Soviet Union legitimacy. It could only ever be a coup d'etat against the wishes of the people. But the revisionist perspective complicated this, because the revolution, they argued, was a popular, authentic uprising. Of course, we have to, they didn't ignore Lenin and the seizure power and the conspiratorial way that the Bolshevik Party operated, but they saw the revolution as a manifestation of people's genuine desires and hopes. And so it became a different story and different question about why the revolution then declined into the horrors of Stalinism. And so things got much more complicated. Today, we understand 1917 differently. That's because we're out of the Cold War, the Soviet Union is no longer here, it collapsed in 1991, and it doesn't have the same type of politically charged debate as it once had. In fact, it's quite muted, really, in terms of commemoration. The centenary of 1917 was 4 years ago, and it was quite a muted affair, particularly in Russia. But in a way, Vladimir Putin is not really interested in commemorating a popular uprising, particularly in current circumstances. But without the politically charged, polarized debate, I think there is a much more moderate and level-headed understanding of 1917, and historians today are less inclined to stick to one side or the other, so the political history or the social history, and narratives and histories and modern histories of the Russian Revolution look to synthesize these different parts. So the revolution, of course, was driven by the people, but it was also shaped by the Bolsheviks. And so we have to see how those two sides interact. There is still lots of room for debate and still lots of room for discussion about this, but I think if we remove the old Cold War politics, as has been done, it's an opportunity for much better understanding of this crucial event in 20th century history. Okay, thank you very much.